Europe's transformation, of the Iron Curtain fall, and obviously tries to dwell into both the successes and failures. And the contributors have been very honest, actually, about the latter. I have a stellar panel today with me. I will start perhaps from Dan, who is on my immediate right, Dan Hamilton, with the Johns Hopkins University. He is a director there of the program The United States, Europe, and the World Order, am I correct? And he's also the president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. He's also one of the co-editors of this book. Then I have Stephen Erlanger, who is not a contributor, but he's been a long-serving observer of what happened not only in Central Europe, but also in Russia after 1989. He was posted to Moscow. He was also posted to Prague. Stephen is actually one of the most experienced journalists I've ever met, and he's currently heading the New York Times bureau here in Brussels. Then I have Anna Wieslander, who is one of the contributors to the book. She is running the Northern Europe program at the Atlantic Council. She's also the Secretary General of the Swedish Defense Association. And then last but not the least, Sławomir Dębski, who is the director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, an institute where I used to actually work in my previous life. And he's also one of the co-editors of this book. My name is Agata Gostyńska-Jakubowska. I am a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform here in Brussels, and I will have the pleasure to chair this panel. What I would like to do is basically ask our panelists to speak for more or less 7-8 minutes. So we have, and I will be very brutal actually in executing the time limits, so that we have ample time for the discussion afterwards. And I would encourage you actually to ask questions, raise comments, etc. And I will start from Sławomir. Sławomir, tell us about the genesis of the book. What inspired you actually to invite all those brilliant people to come along and basically to come up with what constitutes Europe whole and free. And I would be also grateful if you could actually also explain us the whole, definition of the Europe whole and free Bush strategy.
Thank you very much, Agata. We edited we've done this book with, I think, common idea in mind that we should speak about the successes of transatlantic relations and successes of Europe more. I would like to share with you a kind of a real anecdote, because this conversation, the last conversation I had with Senator McCain was November 2016, just after election of Donald Trump, on the margins of Halifax Forum. And I approached him with a very simple question: what Europe should do in this new environment with Donald Trump in the White House. And that was a kind of the short talk about Trump. And I remember I used in this conversation a phrase that actually we achieved so much in transatlantic relations that it goes without saying that the story is about the success. And he stopped me in that moment and said, so say it. If it goes without saying, say it. Because we are very economical in pricing ourselves. And that was an idea, a thought, which stick to my mind. And then sometimes later, when the idea of opening the office of the Polish Institute of International Affairs, or offices, in fact, because we are about to open our office in Brussels and then in Washington, D.C., so soon we will be permanently deployed, so say, in those capitals appeared. So the idea came to my mind that we should have something more than just an opening event. We should have a substance to talk about in Washington, D.C. and Brussels. And we should really, elaborate more about things which goes without saying. So that was the idea. We approached a very impressive group of people from very different, ways of life. There are former politicians, there are diplomats, there are academicians, there are experts. All of these people work on daily basis on transatlantic relations. We meet each other on various occasions, on the conferences, on the seminars, lunches, dinners, and we actually talk about contemporary relations, contemporary problems. We talk about Trump, we talk about Syria, Russia, China, but actually very little time we spend to comprehend what is behind us, how many things materialize, and actually this vision of Europe Holland Free, how it was implemented. So we approach these authors with three very simple questions. How they understand today the idea of Europe Holland Free, what was achieved, and what were the failures and what actually went wrong and why, and what we should do to push the agenda forward. So very simple question. That's question. So that's actually what we got out of it. It's very representative, let's say, collection of interpretations. I believe that all of these authors are, share the view that the idea of Europe, Holland, free and at peace was a absolutely great political program. And however, there were failures here and there. However, we criticize a lot of things, and for a good reason. But definitely, we managed to push the idea of peaceful Europe forward. The idea which was with us since 1918 at least, since the United States entered for the first time war in Europe, and with very clear program to pacify this continent ultimately. 100 years ago, it didn't work. Then the Second World War came, then the Cold War, then the division of Europe, Yalta thing, Berlin War, all this miserable experience we had. And 1989, for the second time, history opened to us and gave us a second chance. And I would say that, yesterday was a brilliant piece in Guardian about Central Europe. I mean, those part of Europe which was deprived of the chance to integrate, to be a part of the free world after World War II. And the author provided absolutely excellent list of arguments that this region is doing extremely well. During the last 30 years, this part of the continent were integrated with the rest of Europe as has never before. That economically, it's booming. Central Europe, and particularly Poland, is the only country in the world that didn't experience, the economic slowdown during the last 30 years. So it is, impressive, and we should simply pay attention on that. we should more talk about that, particularly because we are dealing with generations we didn't experience a Cold War. I voted for the first time 4th of June 1989. That was my first, experience with democracy. But now we have to realize, and I have to realize, that there are a lot of people which actually take democracy for granted, take the peace in Europe for granted. That's they 30 years history of Europe. That's like kind of everyday life. They don't even comprehend that that was a very divided continent, and the continent was at war with each other continuously. And that was the reason behind Woodrow Wilson's idea to pacify it 100 years ago. And still, we will talk about it. The authors say that however we manage a lot, Europe is not united enough. But that was, that's another point for conversation.
Thank you very much, Sławomir. Yes, sorry, this microphone is playing tricks. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to start from where you left, and thank you very much for your introductory remarks. I would agree that in a way we do often, and media, foreign media, does often focus on some of the perhaps failures of the transformation, some of the drawbacks, rather than emphasize the successes. And actually I would like to turn to Anna, who is providing a very fair assessment, I think, in her contribution, looking at both. And one of the questions you asked in your contribution was, well, actually, what went wrong as well? And there are some things which didn't go as we anticipated it, or at least the architects of the transformation. And I would like you, to share your analysis with us. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. Does this work?
Yes.
Yes? It's a small room, doesn't matter. So I will just give you a brief summary of my analysis on the questions that were given to us as contributors, and just finish up with a few reflections on what has happened since I wrote this, because this was actually half a year ago, and things are not going in the right direction as I see it. But the analysis then, I took hold of Europe whole and free as an American strategy for Europe. I think that's important for us Europeans to remember, at a historical transformative period. It was introduced, pushed and implemented by the US, mainly using NATO as its vehicle, and then adopted by the Europeans through the EC and then later on the EU. And the EU actually possessed many of the tools for its success, you can say. So this was an interplay like that, which is important to remember. And that idea of a Europe whole and free was firmly nested into the transatlantic bargain, as it has looked since the foundation of the NATO alliance after the Second World War. And the transatlantic deal rested on two legs. US military support for Europe on one hand, that's what we usually recognize, but the other leg is European attempts towards unity and integration. That's also been on the American agenda all the time. And then this strategy was also embedded into a grander scheme of a new world order. I don't know if you remember that concept of President Bush. This was heavily based on values. It followed a Wilsonian tradition in American foreign policy. So I would argue in this article that this strategy was partially successful. I mean, we did have NATO and EU enlargement. We had a whole arrangement scheme of arms control covering and securing us. We had Russia integrating into G8, WTO, NATO-Russia Council, and so on. And this was mainly due to this first trace of continuity, American support for European unity. And we have to recognize this push that always has come across the Atlantic towards Europe. But as for the scheme of a new world order, it tended to overemphasize the novelty of world politics, the universal appeal of Western values. And accordingly, the US failed to use this unipolar moment as it had when it completely dominated world politics to prepare for an adapted leadership in a world of rising rivals. And this in turn contributed to halt the process towards fulfilling this vision of a Europe whole and free, and left us basically where we are right now. So a major shortfall then was that this strategy, the US underestimated the rivals of the hegemon and the cyclic motion towards revenge and competition. Failure to adapt the American leadership to new circumstances allowed for vacuums which the rivals successfully entered. And I think, just look at last week. Syria, now becoming basically a Russia protectorate, and Serbia, what is that? You know, Russia moving in, yeah. The new Cuba of Europe, question mark. So just to move on to my conclusions then, you can ask questions on this, but I just want to give you the overall framework. When this strategy was initiated in 1989, it was not clear whether the world had entered a novel, unprecedented stage, or if history would repeat itself. Was the US powerful because the strength and supremacy of its values and could act accordingly? Or was its supreme power a systemic effect, creating a hegemon that needed to act benevolently in order to prolong its unipolar moment? In retrospective, it seems as if the US administration, from George H.W. Bush and onwards, leaned more towards the linear rather than the cyclic stance, thereby underestimating the rise of rivals and failing the opportunity to partner with Europe in regional and global leadership in order to prolong its power posture. And given this new geopolitical landscape, is Europe whole and free still a valid European strategy? I think that's fair to answer. Is there any chance of it being successfully implemented ahead, or is it too late? So I think we all agree that the task has become more difficult. And I looked a bit on this. Could it be possible, if you recognize that Europe is once again a contested space? There are some things that we could see that we could move on, matched with a unified approach from the US and the EU, a committed leadership, a willingness to raise the cost if necessary. I think that's really important. We still tend to think that things cost, $100, but the cost is actually $200. Are we willing to pay that price? And we're not really. We're saying, this should be transactional and so on, but I'm not sure it is. It could be costs related to economic sanctions, new sanctions, investments in physical and digital infrastructure, where we see rivals entering, a tougher stance on money laundering that would also actually, fall back on us. We're not that willing to take that cost. Continued open door policies, what do they cost? So here I would like to see, what we need would be US and Europe aligning in response to Russian attempts to create spheres of interest. And I think that has been a major failure, and I would address that failure, from 2007 and onwards, really, in Georgia and all of it, basically. And now we also have China. Will we be able to align on China with the US, Europe and US? Because the big paradox now, and I will end on this, is that I think in this time where we have a major drift in transatlantic relations, this is the time when we need each other the most. And this is really something that is very much bothering me as an analyst, and I hope it's bothering also policymakers. Because this is challenging us to a very large extent, as I see it. Coming here is like Europe whole and free, or is it Europe divided and unfree? I mean, this is really where we have to move ahead as I see it. I think I end there, and we can come back to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I think you brilliantly paved the way for what I actually wanted to ask Daniel. I was based in the US, and I was hoping you could share, sort of your insights on how the current administration is viewing what is happening. What is happening in Europe. You, Anna, also mentioned, I think, one of the, it seems to me, key words here. We tend to look at things in a very transactional way. And that obviously applies also, I think, to the US administration more and more profoundly these days. But Daniel, when I was reading your contribution, I thought, the trend you showed, because Daniel said, the US used to be European power, and now it is shifting, correct me if I'm wrong, shifting towards simply being power in Europe. And that is posing a challenge for Europeans themselves, and I think for the, for the world's order as such. And I wanted to quiz you a little bit about that. What are the challenges referred to this trends for the Europeans? Is there anything we can actually do to convince the US to remain engaged, or whether we should actually as Europeans do more to offset this sort of perhaps a slow process of withdrawal, which, by the way, didn't start with Trump himself. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you. Maybe I just since I'm with Steve here, American in the room, give you a sense from the United States. Everyone always, when I come, everyone wants to know what's the American concept for Europe. It reminds me of a true story, actually. When the double-track decision was being made to station intermediate force weapons here to counter the Soviet SS-20s, long time ago. Helmut Schmidt was in charge of that, and the Reagan administration had just come into office. And the Europeans were apoplectic. Here was this cowboy becoming American president. And Helmut Schmidt called in the ambassador to Germany, then Arthur Burns, and said, "Mr. Ambassador, you have to tell me right now the American concept for Europe." And the ambassador, without missing a beat, has said, "Mr. Chancellor, I'd be delighted to do that. Would you like the concept from this week or last week?" And I think that tells you more than I'm going to be able to say about the Trump administration's European policy. But let me put it in some context. If you think about American engagement in Europe historically, it has been cyclical. It's a cycle between retrenchment and engagement. Until World War I, the United States were trying to be wary of the Europeans. We were building our own country and didn't want European struggles to come to the North American continent. It was only because of World War I there was a need to kind of engage again. But of course, we withdrew. The U.S. Congress didn't even support President Wilson's design for the League of Nations, and the U.S. stepped back again. World War II, we realized we had to engage again. But people tend to forget, because the Cold War came so quickly after that, right after, at the end of World War II, American forces in Europe went way, way down. We withdrew basically again until this new conflict was emerging, and we realized we had to come back and had to be really engaged. And then for 70 years, the United States was what I would call a European power. It broke with its history because of some basic premises that it sort of, I think most people thought they had learned from our history with Europe. And I think it was a bipartisan approach, and it had popular support as well as elite backing. One was that Europe had always been important, but given 2 world wars, Cold War, it was also really urgent. It was not just important, it was urgent. It was what you had to deal with every day because it was the cockpit of the global Cold War. And that was the second premise, that the nature of European order was actually very central to global order. The two were very linked to each other. We had learned that from the 20th century experience with Europe. And the third, that the premise was the only way really to deal with this was the U.S. had to be comprehensively engaged on the European continent. And that's what I mean by being a European power. It had to be integral to all the balances and coalitions the Europeans were building among themselves. It had to provide the umbrella of reassurance to the West Europeans after a world war, 2 world wars, that they could turn to each other and build this experiment in European integration. It had to be able to deter the Soviet Union. It had to be engaged in all sorts of things, building up, Western Germany after the war, and so on. And that was the context of the time of 1989, then, when President Bush said, our next agenda has to be a Europe whole and free, that all the institutions, the things we had created, had provided untold peace and prosperity, but for a half a century, but really for only half a continent. And that the next agenda, as it seemed in 1989, he gave the speech in the spring of 1989, before the walls came down, that this had to be our real ambition. So it was a very expansive notion. It continued a tradition of America as a European power. And President Bush and his team, masterfully helped organize the peaceful end of the Cold War and advance that vision. But again, we tend to forget that at the end of his first term, President Bush was defeated by the American electorate in favor of an inexperienced American governor from Arkansas who said it was time to have the peace dividend. It was time to think about the economy, stupid. And it was about the Pacific. Those were the themes of Bill Clinton when he first entered office. And for the first year of the Clinton administration, frankly, I was in the Clinton administration, it was a mess. There wasn't a sense of whether Europe was important. It certainly wasn't urgent. The only thing urgent was the conflict in a little place called Bosnia, which we didn't want to have anything to do with. But we didn't know what to do because it was a tragedy going on there. But that was preoccupying the first year of the Clinton administration with no real concept. And the real structural momentum in the United States was, again, to come back home, to turn to other issues, and Europe was no longer, it was fixed. The walls came down. Why do we have to be there anymore? So one has to remember that this was the context. Again, after another big conflict, the Cold War, we again withdrew, basically mentally. We didn't know that we needed to be here. And it was only in the first year, after the first year of the Clinton administration, when Bosnia became just too hard to ignore, that we realized we had to make a case again for America as a European power. I worked closely with Richard Holbrooke at the time. He has a piece in Foreign Affairs, exactly the beginning of the second year of the Clinton administration, called America, a European Power. We were working on that together, and he looked at me finally and he said, should we put a question mark in the title? I said, no, that's been the problem, is we always have a question mark. It's time to stop it. And we had to build in a different architecture and a whole range of things that we did that engaged the U.S. back into Europe because we understood, again, these linkages that I mentioned. And through the 1990s, the Clinton administration was fully engaged again in Europe. So by the end of the Clinton administration, it was, again, still a European power. I think that some of that extended into the Bush administration. Anna mentioned a few mistakes, which we could talk about. But I think the natural inclination in the American society was to start to say again, really? Do we have to be so fundamentally engaged? We have so many other problems to deal with. We have so many other issues. One has to remember that 9/11, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, transformed American foreign policy and sort of the whole mentality of the country, so that Europe was sort of important, but these linkages between world order, European order, these things were no longer intuitive for a new kind of generation. And now another, 20 years later, you can see these premises just are not intuitive. Urgent, Europe is important. I don't know that many policymakers think it's urgent. Europe is the order of Europe, yes, important. Is it really central to world order anymore? A new generation of policymakers in the United States don't get that. unless you really sit down and explain it to them. And so why would the Americans have to be a comprehensive European power? So my point is, we can argue about Donald Trump, but I think something deeper is happening that's tied more into the cycles of American history. That is, we are in a period of retrenchment again from European concerns. I think there's real worry in Europe. People are almost as worried about Donald Trump as worried he might abandon Europe. I don't know which is the greater fear here. I don't think abandonment is the scenario because the U.S. is really quite engaged still in Europe. We've in fact increased our defense spending. We're engaged in the eastern part of NATO in ways we hadn't been in the past. But when I say we're moving to being a power in Europe, it really means something fundamentally different. A European power meant we were involved in everything, as I said. Now we're not. We're not comprehensively engaged. We are selectively engaged in many European issues. We are part stakeholder in many issues in Europe, but we're also part spoiler. There is a temptation to what the Bush administration, George Jr. administration, called disaggregation, which is play the Europeans off against each other, because frankly it's so easy to do. So that the nature of European integration isn't so apparently in American interests as perhaps it seemed to have been in the past. And that why can't 500 million Europeans take care more of their own security? And why are they relying on 330 million Americans for that? It is hard to explain that to most Americans. That's what Donald Trump has totally seized upon, because people sort of say, yeah, why is that? Nobody can explain it, really, very well. So this is an historic cycle that it started before Trump. It's likely to outlast Trump. If you look at the real candidates besides President Trump, every Democratic candidate, except Joe Biden probably, would be probably in this camp of thinking of the United States as a power in Europe. I don't see any of them arguing for forceful re-engagement, and they talk about the importance of NATO, but beyond that, there's not like an approach that would have us re-engage fundamentally. So, unfortunately, I end on a very dismal note, which is much of this agenda was premised on the United States sort of being the benign, supportive superpower, helping this project of Europe whole and free move ahead. And somewhere along the way, we started to cycle away from that. And if I may say, our European colleagues became a bit complacent and smug about the project, so that it turned from being a project, a real operational project, into simply a slogan. And that's what I see in Europe today. This has now become a slogan and no more a project. And you see from recent decisions that are being made in this city that much of Europe beyond the EU and NATO is still a very turbulent area. Europe is not fixed. It's a very dynamic, violent place. If you think about the non-integrated spaces, which are vast. And who's going to work on that? It seems to me that the new slogan of Europe, a Europe that protects, is intended to protect some Europeans from other Europeans. That seems to me the great vision now of Europe. And if you put that together with an America that's going to be a power in Europe and not a European power, then I think we have some rough roads ahead.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this. I will actually want to come back to what you said, but before I do this, I would like to turn to Stephen, who's been extremely patient. Stephen, you're an American living, what, half of your life in Europe? At least? Okay. So, I mean, we tend to obviously attend a similar event, the same events with Stephen. And I remember one dinner that we attended. It was off the record, so I'm not going to say who was there. But we had this conversation actually about how Europe transformed, and Warsaw in particular, because we focused at that time on Warsaw, almost on your watch. from this city sort of, slowly transforming from the centrally planned economy into what is, flourishing these days and attracts not only human talent, but obviously investments. What I would like to learn from you is basically your, human touch impressions on how Europe changed. The Europe, which was obviously behind the Iron Curtain, but I would be also very grateful if you could touch upon on Russia, because that's something that I think many contributors have touched upon. But I would like to ask you about that. Obviously, Russia, particularly after 1993, etc.
Agatha, thank you, and thank you to this panel. I've been very patient because it's been fascinating. I would also urge you, really, it's a very good book. When you look at all the contributors, there's a wide range of ages and views and ideologies, and it's really very, very thoughtful and very impressive, and it's out there for you. Now, when I was thinking about this, does this work better? Yeah. Okay. When I was thinking about what to say, I was thinking about what it was like to be a young American entering the Soviet bloc for the first time in 1981. Okay, nearly, 40 years ago. This was the Solidarność summer, and I was a young correspondent for the Boston Globe, and I spent nearly 4 months traveling through every country of what we then called Eastern Europe, beginning in Poland, but going to every single country, getting visas along the way, which was very, very difficult. The hardest visa to get was the DDR, East Germany, because they're utterly paranoid. But the first visa that came was Bucharest. And I cannot tell you what it felt like to get off the plane in this Ceausescu, Romania, in a hotel which was full of African students, secret police, prostitutes, and me, basically. This was the Intercontinental Hotel in Bucharest, which is still there. And Bucharest has changed quite a lot too. But this is a memory it helps, because looking out, I'm older than most of you. What a different world this was. I was wandering around Bucharest trying to talk to people in French, which one could sort of do. And there was a bookshop. And in the window of this bookshop was the collected works of the Ceausescu family. Nikolai, his wife, his kids, his uncles. And yet the window was covered in spider webs and worms and bird shit. It was quite extraordinary. And I went in and chatted to the bookseller. And I said, "That's a very beautiful window you have." And he looked at me and said, "Yes, I think of it as a work of art." Now, that was about as brave as people got, certainly then, because I was at the bar one night in the Intercontinental, and this very attractive young guy comes up to me and says to me in very good English, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I think you probably know very well." And he said, "Well, it's going to be hard for you to work here," he said, "because if you approach a Romanian is supposed to report all contacts with Westerners to the police. So a Romanian is likely to withdraw." And he said, "And if a Romanian approaches you," he said with a great big smile, "perhaps you should withdraw." And in the end, I bought him a drink, and we had a chat. But the notion of the antipody of this different world, and as a young, kind of fairly left-wing American guy who was very interested in socialism and in the left's critique of Western capitalism, those 4 months were an eye-opener, not just because people lived so miserably, which they did, I cannot tell you how miserably they lived. Toilet paper seemed to be something that socialism couldn't produce in any sufficient amounts. Condoms were known as galoshes because they were as thick as boots. It was a miserable kind of period. There was, but there was also a deep cynicism, I would have to say. I would go around talking to editors of state newspapers, so on and so on, just utterly staggered by the cynicism of these interviews and by the falsity of much of what was being said. And one had the sense this was something fragile. Not that it was about to end, but that it was fragile, that it was false, that it was built on occupation, first of all, because that's true, and built on a fake solidarity. And so it's interesting to have two poles here, because frankly, without the poles, I think none of this would have been necessary, beginning in '56 and onward, very stubborn people, the Poles. And in '81, I remember meeting Lech Wałęsa in Gdańsk. The price of an interview with Lech Wałęsa then was a carton of Dunhills, which seemed well worth paying. And I kept going back. I mean, I know more about, unfortunately, communism, socialism than any normal person ought to actually remember. And then I went to Moscow for the first time in '85, when Gorbachev first became General Secretary, and Mrs. Thatcher had said the previous December, this is a man with whom we can do business. So I was very fortunate to kind of watch the building of this new understanding. But at the same time, so few people predicted the end. I mean, you knew the strains. The strains inside the Soviet Union were really, it was a repressed nationalism. The Soviet Union was always, full of other nations that had been repressed, much as the East Europeans had been repressed, suppressed, conquered. And so under the guise of ecology, under the guise of lots of things, what you had was a kind of national revolt. And Gorbachev, I must say, I give him credit for this. He could have cracked down. It would have worked, and he chose not to. Now, everything Gorbachev wanted to happen, he failed at, right? He wanted to preserve the Communist Party. He wanted to preserve the Soviet Union. He wanted to bring democracy to the party. Failed at everything. But we honor him for basically not being Stalin. And that is worth remembering. Now, there are lots of reasons why, '89 happened. A lot of it having to do with the fatigue of this system, which I've tried to describe, and a lot of it having to do with the bravery of the people living underneath it, not just in the streets, but in the brains of Václav Havel, of other people, who actually understood that holding to truth was the most powerful act anyone could possibly do in the face of an oppressive system. And most people are cowards. I mean, that's what I learned in '81. Cynical, atomized, people lived for their privileges. There were very few brave people, but the brave ones mattered, and sometimes they were the ones that you least expected. Now, it was a difficult transition, even in Poland. One of the few heroes I have in my life, unfortunately dead, was the Polish foreign minister, Bronisław Geremek, who I first met under martial law in Warsaw. I came to Warsaw and bought Polish clothes so I would not look so obviously Western. And I did that because I had in mind this wonderful scene from Master and Margarita, if you've read this wonderful Bulgakov novel, where the devil comes to Moscow and it sits by Patriarch's Pond. And Bulgakov has this wonderful line, they knew he was a foreigner because of his shoes. So I made sure not to look like the devil at Patriarch's Pond. And Geremek and I would sit in he was in jail in '81, but by by martial law, he'd been kind of let out, but he was under restrictions. And we talked about the future, we cried together. He was an enormously wonderful man. And then he became foreign minister, and I went back to see him. And this is the strain, because he told me this was the time where Poland was in the middle. And Jacques Chirac, the president of France at the time, said to Geremik, look, you have to choose. You choose Europe or the Americans. You choose EU or choose NATO. Right? This was the French choice. So I actually wrote this story, and I get a furious phone call from a man called François Delattre, who was then the press guy at the French embassy in Washington, and a very nice guy who then became French ambassador to the UN and to the United States, and is still a wonderful guy. And he calls me and says, what are you doing to me? I said, what do you mean? He said, Chirac's furious. I said, well, why is he angry with me? He said, well, he claims he never said this to Geremik. I said, well, it was Geremik who told it to me. I mean, I quoted Geremik accurately. So he goes, oh, God, and he hangs up the phone. And then 2 days later, I get a call from Geremik, which was pretty unusual. I said, oh, my God, what are they doing to me? She says, you know, the French are furious. I mean, that Chirac says, I mean, that I have to fix this. So help me fix this. And I said, well, okay. So what we did in the end is we ran what we call a little clarification that said that the Polish Foreign Minister Geremik said that Chirac said this, but Chirac said that he hadn't. But, I mean, this gives you an idea of the strain over the American concept. I think Anna is quite right. I mean, this was always part of the American idea, which is partly, we can't leave Europe to its own devices, because look what they do to themselves. They did it in the first war, and they did it in the second war, and they did it in Bosnia, and they did it in Kosovo, and who the hell knows when they're going to do it to themselves again, right? And now we risk that, because the only reason the Americans ever come back to see Europe as urgent, as Dan said, is when something really goes wrong. And this is what worries me, because one can look at a lot of things that could go wrong. Now, I could go on, but I won't, because we would love to get you involved. But I would end by saying this. It's very hard for the United States to help a Europe continue with a project in which Europeans have themselves lost faith. And I think that is the biggest dilemma that we all face here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, for sharing all those stories with us. Having listened to you, I have an impression that French thinking actually hasn't changed that much. But anyway, before I actually turn to the audience, I would like us perhaps to react to each other's remarks and perhaps focus on something which we haven't really sort of emphasized enough. One of the things that actually Daniel alluded to at the end, that European colleagues became complacent actually about the whole Europe whole and free idea, and perhaps about its own security. And I wonder whether you could comment on and sort of share your insights on where you see Europe heading. I mean, we have new EU leadership. There are some buzzwords that Daniel referred to, Europe that protects, but I think in this context what might be even more interesting is actually geopolitical commission or geopolitical union. You know, does it actually mean anything? So I would like you to perhaps comment on this. And then when I was reading individual contributions, I think what I also spotted is another important trend that both the US and Europe is looking at carefully is obviously a greater assertiveness of China and its assertive behavior in Europe, but obviously also increasingly assertive Putin's Russia. And where does it leave a transatlantic relationship? I would like you to perhaps entertain those problems a little bit. Shall I start from you, Slavek?
Okay, three remarks I would like to add, using as a point of departure interventions of my colleagues. First, about Europe Holland Free as an American project. So first, sure, all book is about that, and in my contribution to this book, I made very clear that there was a kind of the continuation of thinking about peaceful Europe. But there was also, I would like to emphasize, a kind of the Polish thinking into that. In our introduction to the book, we mentioned Zbigniew Brzeziński, a famous article of 1984, so 4 years before 1989, when untitled Yalta Unfinished Business. That was a very famous sentence. When he made the point that we should think about the reunification of Germany, and consequently a reunification of whole Europe. And he also wrote that there are many thoughtful Europeans who actually try to explain to the people that without the reunification of Germany, we cannot think about, free Central Europe and reunification of the whole continent. And actually, he was referring to the Paryska Kultura, a kind of the émigré cycle in Paris and London about Jerzy Giedroyć and Miroszewski, who actually try to educate Polish people first, and those who lived abroad, but also the Polish opposition, that we should accept the idea of reunification of Germany, because without the reunification of Germany, Poland would have never been free. And that was a kind of the very logical, strategic thinking behind, which was also important for the whole story of Europe, Holland Free. Using this Brzeziński's concept, one may say that Europe whole and free is unfinished business now. I fully agree with Stephen's description that Europe is a kind of the, in kind of the miserable strategic situation now. Without the United States engaged, we simply don't know how to behave ourselves. Not only, I'm not only want to say that we should worry about wars, but I agree that there are a lot of things in Europe and outside of the European Union which can be a serious cause for concern. The recent decision to stop enlargement, even thinking about enlargement, not enlargement itself, because we were talking about opening negotiations with these two countries, and we negotiate our EU membership with Turkey for 40 years, 50 years. So it was not urgent thing. It was a kind of idea that we need to organize our neighborhood. And last two things. One may use Lenin's line to describe that pacifying Europe, it is about making 2 steps forward and 1 step back all the time. Yes, we do, we are progressing in this endeavor, and we are much farther than we used to be 30 years ago. And we should be, happy about our achievements, but it is not enough. That's, with this message, it's not enough. And Russia is one of the key issues here, because without peaceful democratic Russia, fully subscribing itself to this vision, as they did for 4 years, more or less. Because without Gorbachev, we should state it. Without Gorbachev, we would not have been able to achieve all this. That was Gorbachev who actually recalled so-called Brezhnev doctrine and said that the Soviet Union would not intervene in Central Europe and would not be against democratization in these countries. So that was a kind of the Gorbachev response to this Bush famous Mainz speech, but also politically it was huge contribution to the whole process. Then in 1993 they started to hamper this process, but that was another story. I believe Tom Wright in our book also makes a very important point about Russia and China. That now we are more and more facing ideological competition again. Particularly in the context of advanced technologies. As long as we talk about, gas and oil, that was, a classic thing. But when we start to talk about artificial intelligence, 5G, all these complexities connected with the new technologies, then it does matter whether you are a democratic country or you are an authoritarian one. And now we are facing this challenge. Both, United States and Russia together, and Europe together. Thank you.
Speaking of actually technology and development of the 5G network, obviously this is one of the areas where Europe is not united, does not speak with one voice. Some Central European countries have slightly different views, and I think that's obviously not the only area where it seems to me also China, as you said, the US seems to be playing one member state against the other. I think China is also a very keen student and is becoming much more assertive. So I wondered whether perhaps Daniel or Anna would like to comment on this. And obviously, since Sławomir said that, Putin has also made it clear that obviously what happened, the fall of the Iron Curtain, was one of the biggest tragedy for the, actually today Russia, obviously playing into the hands of the public. So do you have anything to add on this perhaps and on each other's contributions? And then I will immediately turn to the audience.
Yeah, I can start. I look at it like this with China and where we are standing now. If we talk about Europe whole and free, the institutions have been very important. That's been a way of framing this wholeness for us, NATO, the EU. But what we are entering now is a world of more and more great powers, less superpowers, but more and more great powers. And we will soon have the UK also outside of the EU, so even more great powers, and China rising. So, and there you have very different, important strategic choices to make. Will you start going bilateral between these great powers? China obviously trying and getting benefits of doing that, and it's natural for them. But will Europe also split up on this and kind of meet China on this? And what you will meet then is what the US has done, always as great powers do. They give a little bit to that country, which is obviously often a smaller country, and then you say, okay, I'll support it. And that's how you build the fragmentation, and you divide step by step. And this we have to be very beware of, I believe, and it connects to your question of a geopolitical commission and Europe as a global actor. I think the analysis is right in saying that yes, we need to be more geopolitically aware. Europe should be able to be more of a global actor. I think we all can agree on that. And if Europe is not a global actor, who would be a global actor? Authoritarian regimes? Who would spread any kind of values and stand up for free trade and so on if we don't do it? But are we there? Definitely not. And I think this enlargement decision last week was so telling, where Europe stops this, and with a veto from one of our great powers on the table. and just a situation for everybody else to try and sort out, basically, signaling that we don't care about enlargement. That, I mean, you can say, did France put the veto on the table for internal reasons, for the EU integration, as they have stated since 2018 and so on, or perhaps for Macron, his electorate and so on? Probably yes and yes on those issues, right? But then if you look at this geopolitically, you can't look at the Western Balkans and not realize that this is a battle going on. So either France is not aware of this, which is not that likely, or they are aware of what's going on and think it's acceptable at this point.
And then at the same time, Macron is coming up with the initiative to sort of reach out to Russia, which is not obviously, I mean, at least sounds like it's not consulted with other EU member states.
It's a feeling of going more and more bilateral and as little as possible with the European Union. And if it is like that, I think all middle-sized countries, smaller countries, need to be very, very aware of this. And I think it requires another level of agenda setting, of negotiation, and perhaps alignment with Berlin, or who else can do this is in a manner that we have not had to do before.
Sure. Daniel, would you like to come?
Well, if I could go back to your original question and back to the premise here. So, you know, Europe whole and free over 25 years became sort of the paradigm, not just for Americans, but for most Europeans, of how the continent would evolve. I think it was the basic framework, a sort of a mindset that informed most policy. And it was essentially that a magnetic, relatively magnetic and fairly unchallenged Western-led order would not only provide more peace and prosperity for the integrated parts of Europe, but would start to expand gradually and incorporate over time those parts of Europe that had not been integrated. And that included not only Central Europe, but extended to the Balkans, to Eastern Europe, and eventually would have a place for Russia. And that the United States would play this benign, supportive role at the same time as the old tensions started to build down, arms control, withdrawal of forces, all sorts of things that were going to happen. And what we've seen over the last, say, 10 years is that almost all of the either spoken or unspoken assumptions that behind that paradigm have been shattered. So Europe is now kind of in a strategic vacuum. I don't think there is nothing there that's informing European policy. I mean, just think of some of the elements. I mentioned the U.S. is no longer playing the role that it did. Russia, has shown that, the future may not belong to civilian powers, as sort of was the premise. Hard power matters. You can actually change borders by force in Europe and get away with it. Russia's not lost in transition somewhere on this model. It's going its own way. And that simply fundamentally challenges sort of some of these premises. The notion that Europe would continue to expand and transform its neighborhood has been flipped on its head. Now this part of Europe is afraid of being transformed by its neighborhood. And you see that by the most recent decision. But it wasn't just the recent decision. The project, as I said, somewhere along the way just became a slogan. I mean, the Eastern Partnership, all of that was an operational policy for some time, and it turned into kind of nothingness after a while. There is nothing that is being offered to a great space of Europe, from the Western Balkans all the way up to the Baltic Sea, and which these people do not know where their future is. We're not doing much to help them. And what was originally a transformative project has become sort of a compensatory project. Hold them off as long as we can. Buy them off, do whatever you can, but my God, don't let them be part of our world. And that is a recipe, if you think anything about European history, for just disaster. Whenever we ignore the twilight zones of Europe, we always pay a higher price later, and we're about to relive this yet again. So I'm sorry, but I'm so dismal about this because I just see this developing. And the notion that, the slogan "More Europe" would solve people's problems was, shown to be just illusory when the migration crisis happened. More Europe didn't answer anybody's challenges. The Europe and the institutions did nothing to a mayor in some little town who gets a phone call and says, tomorrow 2,000 people are showing up in your little town. Be ready, and you're on your own. And so there, it was shown to be abstract, distant, not relevant anymore to what real issues had been for a lot of people. The notion that one of the leading countries defining what it means to be the West has opted out of the European project is really quite something. This country, but you also, again, the notion that you have stable European countries that are the epitome, the symbol of stability, democratic stability, reveal themselves to be deeply polarized, fractured societies like the UK is just, stunning. And yet here we are. And in this vacuum, I think what baffles most of my European friends even more, you find three revisionist powers. The Russians we've talked about. They like to smash the rules. Everybody knows that. The Chinese, though, China has become also a power in Europe. It's not very distant. It's right here. The notion, we always have these debates with the Americans, the Europeans, about so-called pivot to Asia. What I think hasn't occurred to many Europeans is Asia has pivoted to Europe, and it's present. And China in particular has a very, growing presence here as a power in Europe. And China doesn't smash the rules, it sort of erodes the rules. It's a different approach. And it is more the systemic competitor. But Russia is closer and more desperate, so might be more dangerous. But then the most baffled one, back to my point, is the United States. The United States is having a fundamental debate about whether it also should be a revisionist power, revising the very bargains that it created 70 years ago for the international institutions of governing this world. We're having a deep debate about that. We haven't decided. I don't believe we've decided. That's the good news, maybe. But it's a debate, and it's more open-ended, I think people on this side of the Atlantic understand. It's more open to influence than maybe people on this side of the Atlantic understand. But it is completely baffling, I think, to many Europeans that the United States has become this power in Europe rather than the European power. And I think if you put all of that into the strategic vacuum that I mentioned, there's no geopolitical commission, there's no geoeconomic anything that I see, frankly. These are all words. There's nothing behind it that I can see. It's desperation almost. And this is not a good sign for the future of Europe. And Americans might not be there to help you through it. And that's my concern.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Stephen, do you want to come at this point?
Very quickly. Very, very quickly, because you'd asked me to say something about Russia, and I hadn't, and I would simply say one of the interesting questions that's brought up in these essays is, did we mishandle Russia? I mean, I remember, there were debates about should NATO disappear when the Warsaw Pact disappeared. Even Madeleine Albright wrote an essay favoring the disappearance of both alliances and proposing the OSCE as the way to manage European security. And one can argue, as many do, beginning with George Kennan and onward, whether this American triumphalism pushed Russia away or whether Russia was always going to push itself away. One could argue that Ukraine itself is an indication of European failure, of American failure, also Russian failure, that even the annexation of Crimea, which has become such a touchstone, the one Europe is getting tired of touching, I have to say, was a bit of an accident had Yanukovych never run away. I doubt Russia would ever have seized Crimea, which has changed lots of things. So this is all to say that you know, everything in retrospect seems a given, but actually policy is very fluid. And even with Russia today, I mean, we tend to, I mean, Dan said rightly, you know, it's more desperate, so maybe it's more dangerous, but we forget how little it is and how unreformed it is, how dependent it is on oil and gas, how dependent it is on European consumers, frankly. There are bigger internal challenges, it seems to me. But now I will stop there and let you take over again.
Yes, I would like to turn to you. You've been also very patient with us. We have over 30 minutes, 35, for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, and I will take several of them, okay? And please state your affiliation. And shall I just handle the microphone, or will you do that? Hello? Okay, thank you. Okay, this one is, and this one is not working. Yes, it works? We are doing something.
1, 2.
Okay. I'm telling you, it wasn't working.
Hi, Bart Shevchik. Thanks very much for your remarks, first of all. I'm at the European Political Strategy Center and the non-resident fellow at GMF. I wanted to ask a question about the U.S. as a European power and what is the scope of that role. And if you think about back to 2016, President Obama's sort of engagement in European politics, the limits of that was basically his speech right before the Brexit referendum vote in London, and then rumors about potentially moving the NATO summit from Warsaw to some other part of Europe as a way of putting pressure on the Polish government for rule of law violations. But there was not much appetite for greater engagement in European politics. And so I guess the question is, what is your vision as to what is the appropriate role for US engagement, and what would be a welcomed role from Europe's side? So for instance, as a concrete example, you know, to the extent that there are negotiations about the new relationship between the UK and the EU 27 after Brexit, should the US be more engaged in that process, in formally or informally or in some other way? And sort of a corollary to this question is, what are the downsides of too much US engagement? And so, you know, if you think about back to the beginning of the Cold War, there was a little bit of interference in domestic processes, as it were, elections in Italy to make sure that they came out the right way. And in the beginning of the Trump administration, there was concern that maybe the US government or maybe right-wing conservative groups, private groups in the United States would intervene on behalf of liberal forces and right-wing movements in Europe. And is that a realistic risk and concern that Europe could face, that sort of an overly engaged US might be engaged on the wrong side of history or wrong side of the issues? Or is that not something to be worried about? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bart. There was a question on the other side of the room.
Hi, my name is Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. So just short comment and one question, if I may. I can agree with the most I've had in here, but you know, some kind of some things worry me quite a lot, because that is about a perception of Russia. You know, it's remind me my discussion with my father, who was living in Crimea and supported annexation of Crimea himself. He believed strongly that you know, this move was like a restoration of the USSR. So for people of his generation, it was like that. But the truth is that there is no even close approach between the modern Russia and the USSR. Because in USSR, you was dealing with ideology. There was some set of rules in the USSR. But what we have dealing right now with Russia, this is like a kleptocratic dictatorship, as I can describe that. You know, then you are dealing with a thief and you are an honest man. It's quite difficult to have a business, especially business as usual, with them. So that I just like you to look at that from that point of view. It is not any ideology or ideological concept behind. And now the question. There was the quite ancient concept of the free trade area from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And I believe that just that concept is behind the President Macron belief in European, so-called European Russia. I'm just interested what you think about that concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions so that we take them in free, or not now? You need to warm up. Okay. Then I will turn to panelists. There was Bart's question, U.S.-European power. I think I would ask Daniel to elaborate on this one. And then there was a very interesting observation on Ukraine's. If that's fine, I would like you, Sławek, to dwell into this. You actually worked quite a lot. You did a very good research on also annexation of Crimea. And then I will leave it to either Anna or Stephen if they want to talk about also Macron's vision of the future relationship with Russia. And obviously there is another buzzword of this time, which you mentioned, not me this time, which is Brexit, obviously. And that's something that again was mentioned in various contributions. What do you think in general would be the implications of UK's withdrawal for the actually transatlantic relationship? UK used to act as a proxy also for the US when it comes to the relationship with the EU.
I don't think many British would appreciate that characterization as being the proxy of the U.S., but I'll let that go. I mean, a couple points. Just on the context, since you mentioned that. Think of the most urgent issues in Europe for the United States at the moment. There are three countries. One is Turkey, one is Ukraine, and one is the UK. None of them part of the European Union. So non-EU Europe is really important to the United States. And one will not equate Europe with EU in the future either. So one just has to understand the real question marks about Europe are surrounding this place right here. And that's where the US is going to have to pay attention. So the UK relationship will be critical, but it's really very uncertain how that will play out. And try to relate that to Bart's question. I think my point before was the idea that somehow we would go back to some ideal relationship before Trump, that this was all a nightmare and somehow we just kind of go back to something, I think it is an illusion. Because as I've been trying to say, there are deeper currents here that are beyond any particular person or administration. I think both sides, in a way, are stumbling to looking for a kind of a new balance across the Atlantic, if you will. I think in Europe, most Europeans would appreciate less of a heavy-handed U.S. presence, and I think most Americans would probably also, welcome a less costly or, overwhelmingly engaged Americans in Europe, for the reasons I stated. But how that balance looks is, of course, the question. And whether we do it right without all sorts of frictions would, of course, be the question. Right now, all the political tensions are getting in the way of trying to find that balance. So it's hard to say, but if I had to give some guidelines, I would orient to sort of what I think are sort of enduring American interests in Europe that really transcend most any administration. I think they continue through time. And to judge any, a Europe that's more Europe, if you will, and less America, would probably have to meet some of those American tests to get U.S. support. One is just basic principle. Americans want a Europe that's open. So open to democracy, to freedom, and to American investment in ideas and goods. So any initiative that would maintain a Europe that's open would probably be readily welcomed by the United States. But if one sees initiatives that question that premise, like technological sovereignty, which is the new word, or strategic autonomy, which is no one understands in the United States, or anything that would be discriminatory in the way of shutting out Americans, I think you would find blowback on particular policy initiatives while maintaining the overall positive theme. The second, I think the United States wants a Europe that is able to take care of its own civil wars, its own conflicts, without having recourse to the Americans if it doesn't need to. Unfortunately, we've seen for the last 100 years or so, that's not been possible. And that is a prime reason why the United States is still fundamentally engaged here, not out of hegemonic impulse, but because simply it doesn't work here to deal with the violent spaces of Europe without somehow the Americans being involved. So Americans would be the first to cheer if Europeans could show they could do that. But they can't. They haven't shown that yet. And so that is a test. If Europe can build the kind of capability, and that's the part of the European, so-called strategic autonomy most Americans would support, is the capabilities, build the capabilities that Europe shows that they can do real stuff, rather than more process. I think you would find U.S. Support for that. I think a third is a Europe that's not dominated by any country or a combination of countries hostile to the United States. We fought world wars on that premise and a Cold War. I don't see anything happening right now in that realm, but back to the point, Russia's very engaged, China has become a power in Europe, and again, it's questionable what the EU, in the strategic vacuum, what its future trajectory will be. And that leads to my last point, is I think most Americans want a Europe that is America's counterpart, not a counterweight to engagement on lots of third issues, not far beyond European shores, that no country, including a superpower, can deal with on its own. I think most Americans look to that Europe to be our partner on all sorts of other issues around the world. And whether Europe can be that partner has been the question mark. So I think the problem will be that we are in a moment where in Europe, many people point to Donald Trump as bashing Europe to share more of the burden. He's not really doing that. He is not into burden sharing, he's into burden shedding. He's trying to shed burdens, and whatever happens doesn't matter. It's not in our interests. Just look what happened in the Middle East recently. But he's doing that in big parts of the world. And the question is, will Europe step into those big white spaces that the United States is leaving behind or not? And that's where the Europeans are inconsistent in terms of the burden sharing, because I'm not sure that's going to happen. So we are, the seams and the gaps between sort of this burden shedding and burden sharing is, I think, where all the tensions are across the Atlantic. And then you have Russia and China in particular interested in having their own agenda as part of that. It makes it much more difficult. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Before I turn to Sławomir, perhaps 2 cents from me, if I may, on the UK's EU relationship post-Brexit and sort of potential US place in it. I think much will really depend, obviously, on UK's ambition on how robust this relation should be. I mean, if we look, sort of through economic prisms, it has become clear that for the moment there are not great ambitions, and they've been sort of sketched out very, very recently. I would like to see greater ambition on security and defense front. Fortunately, the political declaration, which is setting out the future framework, has remained more or less the same as the deal negotiated by May's administration. But I think the sort of very fruitful relationship would require also some greater imagination from the EU side. And when it comes to also what Daniel was saying about my perhaps unfortunate comment on UK's being proxy, what the UK has started doing, and that's also the analytical exercise that many of us have engaged into, is basically looking at the current informal relationships, particularly in security and defense front, between the EU and, say, US, Norway, etc. And this is where I think the UK could look at those and find the proper way of plugging itself into the EU structure. And I think EU should also go extra mile to help this for the sake of EU, sort of Europe's own security. But that's from me. Sławomir, do you want to take the one on Ukraine, perhaps?
Yes, I will try to stay brief. I co-edited a book about Crimea from the point of view of international law. So actually, I wrote extensively about the issue. So, but to cut the long story short, I have been argued for a lot of years that since mid of 90s or perhaps 1993, we have been dealing in Europe with the competition of two different models of development. One, encapsulated by the idea of Europe whole and free, based on democratic principles, free market economy, rule of law, and symbolized by NATO and the European Union, and another one based on interconnections between business, politics, secret services, and crime. And the second model has been supported by Russia. I don't want to go into discussion whether it was by design or it just happened that Russia chose to be a main polar of the second model of development. This brings me to European contribution to the idea of intellectual idea of Europe whole and free. Because a part of the United States, Europe tried to push the policies of pacifying Europe. We should remember about the Helsinki Final Act, when the European contributions was very significant. Then the Charter of Paris of 1919. That was also a very significant political contribution of Europe. One of the main principles Europe tried to achieve was that we would not restore to the use of force or threat of use of force as a mean of foreign policy in Europe anymore. So it was first in Helsinki, then in Paris after 1989. And what Russia did, actually, they first blackmail all Europe, and including United States as a European power, that they would use force if European model of development became too attractive. And when in 2004, during the Orange Revolution, when actually Ukrainians were wrapping themselves in the blue flag of 12 golden stars, Russia did it for the first time. Putin said that if it goes farther, we would not be neutral. In 2007, famous Munich speech, actually, Putin restored to threaten all the other Europeans that Russia would not give up Ukraine. And then in Bucharest summit, NATO Bucharest summit, again, he said that Ukraine is a kind of Seasonstadt, that it is not fully recognized as an independent country. and it's kind of the international agreement that we recognize Ukraine as an independent country. He said that. So that's actually what I have in mind, that these two different models of development still compete with each other. Russia is as a weaker partner, unattractive, unable to produce attractive model for development for the people, has to restore to use of force to block people marching towards democracy and the free world. And last thing about United States, a part of Russia, we have additional player in backing the second model of development. It is China. United States diplomats are traveling around the world saying, don't cooperate with them, don't do this, don't do that. Actually, I was in the room a couple of weeks ago with representatives of the Balkan countries, both experts and politicians, and they responded to this such messaging coming from the United States. Do you have a strategy against China? Do you have it? No. There is no clear China strategy in the United States. That's why there is no clear strategy on China in Europe as well, because there is no clear leadership. There is no clear aim what the United States, what the free world is going to achieve in its relations with China and then Russia. So that's why we need in Europe more strategic thinking in the United States and more coherent signal where we are going.
Anna, would you like to comment on what Sławomir perhaps said? And if I could ask you, perhaps both and Stephen, to be relatively brief so that we can gather one more round of questions if there are any. Okay? Thank you.
Yes, I thought I could comment on Macron, France, Russia, because I just visited Paris last week and had conversations around this. And it was hard to get a final, vision of where France is heading when it comes to Russia. But I mean, clearly, Macron sees France as a regional great power, and sees some value in Russia as a player of great power too in Europe. And I made a little list. I would just take a few seconds from June onwards on French kind of initiatives with regard to Russia. So in June, Russia returned to Council of Europe. That was a French yes to that. Also in June, new impetus to strategic dialogue with Russia. And then in August, we had Russia is deeply European. That's a quote from Macron. We had also let's invite Russia to G7 in 2020. That was a French go on that one, as well as a new architecture of trust and security with Russia, also in August. And then now, as I commented on earlier, the veto on EU enlargement can also be seen as a way of hinting at Russia its role on Western Balkans, that at least you're not super seriously concerned about it if you act like that. So what's next when it comes to Ukraine? I worry about perhaps the French initiative on neutralization or Finlandization of Ukraine. Put that on a table for discussion, for instance.
I worry about this too. I think French are overreaching, which is a story I'm trying to write now. But on Ukraine, I wish Europe would decide what matters to it, and I think Ukraine ought to matter to it. It just seems to me the best riposte to Putin is to make a success of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has all kinds of problems, and we all know it. There's corruption, there's oligarchy, blah, 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 but there's a chance with Zelensky and his majority in parliament for some kind of alteration, a Zelensky who speaks good Russian, which is important, which is sort of pacifying, for a country that's essentially federal, right? I mean, it's pretty divided thanks to Mr. Stalin. So this worries me. This worries me more, actually, than Serbia or so on. I mean, this is really a problem because we see what's happened in Washington when Ukraine has become an object of politics and not of policy. And there is a vacuum there. I think Macron wants to fill it. I mean, I admire him understanding that the Germans have a zombie coalition, nothing's happening. The Italians have kind of a fake government. The Spanish are about to have their third election. The British are leaving. There's a vacuum in Europe, and he's trying to fill it. The problem is he loves talking as much as Castro, and he loves throwing ideas out, and he's alienating the very European allies he needs to get anything done. That's the problem. But Ukraine, I think we all need to actually focus on and make a strategic aim and policy.
I just want to add one thing more on Ukraine, just 1 minute, and that's, I think we talked about the new geopolitical commission, for instance, now, and I think this is a great new start, also taking more ambition, higher ambition towards Ukraine when it comes to support shift of structure away from the oligarchic structure. So, for instance, working on antitrust legislation. And that could be a topic also to work with Washington, actually, ahead.
By the way, on this note, probably some might disagree, but I'm not sure whether actually offering this portfolio of neighborhood and enlargement to a Hungarian commissioner is actually showing that commission wants to be geopolitical. We still have 10 minutes. No obligation to ask questions, but it would be good to get your final, perhaps, impressions. Are there any questions? Yes, there is one there. The gentleman wearing glasses.
Thank you. This gentleman's name is Bartek Czerski. I'm sorry for my voice. I have a certain infection, but I'll try to express myself. I represent Business and Science Poland, which is a Polish advocacy organization, business association in Brussels. I have a question. It's a sort of comment and question first about what Mr. Dembski said about, let's say, U.S. strategy on China. Because, I mean, you said that the U.S. doesn't have a strategy on China. Perhaps it's not a strategy, but what I see is that, at least in economic terms, which is also geopolitical aspect, is that U.S. sees that it lost its it stopped to be a beneficiary of the post-war order, economic order, and it's trying to push out China from this. And then the question is what to build on that, on the ruins on that. And of course, the U.S. cannot live in isolation in economic terms. So the question is what will happen then? And then the question to Mr. Hamilton is about the relation between US and EU, because my feeling is that if the US wants to push out China from the global economic order to build something new, well, obviously US needs allies, including EU, either in changing attitude of China, which it's not likely to happen, but rather to build something new. And you said that you sense that in the US there is a deeper feeling that there is something that has to be fixed between the US and EU. And I wonder what you mean exactly by that, because my feeling is that US, there is a understanding in the US that in order to confront China, US needs EU, at least in economic terms. So if you can elaborate a little bit more what you mean by the fact that there is this deeper feeling in the US that a deeper road that is growing between EU and US that cannot be simply ignored, and this will not disappear with the next administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Okay, so I guess it was directly aimed at Daniel and Sławomir. So Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I think it's mainly about China, and then how does it relate to U.S.-EU. So I think the one focuses again on the Trump administration's approach, but I think I could safely say I think there is now a pretty bipartisan consensus in the United States that we have to have a different approach to China, and that 25 years ago we made a bet on China, which was that we could integrate it into the global trading system through the WTO, and that over time that type of integration, interaction, economic engagement would start to show some political changes also within the country. It was part of that paradigm that I mentioned applied on a global scale, if you will, and China was part of that. I think there's a basic consensus in the United States now we lost the bet. And that now we have to think about China in a very different way. Now, what the Democrats would do about it, what the Trump administration would do about it, I think are somewhat different, but one should not underestimate there's sort of a basic consensus on this. So even if there would be a Democratic administration, I think you'd find a very tough China policy. I think within the Trump administration, I think there are actually still very different views. That's why maybe Slavomir was saying there's no strategy. I think the president himself, the person of Donald Trump, he's a very transactional person. He just wants a deal. He wants to be able to show to his base he can strike a better deal with that country than anybody else, and he can kind of push back on them. And I think that's the extent of the strategy in his mind. I think those around him who are his economic advisors and actually working on this are more conceptual and strategic, and they do talk about either decoupling, some of his advisors, or simply transforming China in a different way, but not in the under the old bet. So I think decoupling is too stark of a term. We're not going to decouple from China. It's just not going to happen. But I think the debate we're having, not only in the United States, but in Europe, I think too, also in other countries, is what I would define as our political systems wanting to redefine the terms of interdependence that they have gotten themselves into over the last 30 years. I think there's a big political debate in all of our countries about that. What's the right balance between being fully globalized and part of this system and having some say over its effects? And China, for us, has become sort of the strategic touch point of that debate. And I think that's where we are debating now. What's the appropriate terms of interaction with a Leninist, country that is still dominated by the Communist Party, but is decided to go for, an economic model that's quite challenging. So I think that's where we are in our debate on that. I think Europe, most European countries I know, share sort of the view that of the United States, bipartisan view, that China is not quite playing by the rules. It is, there are lots of restrictions on foreign investment in China. There's forced technology transfer. There's a whole lots of things that it's not doing, and I think the U.S. and the EU actually agree on most of those things. So does Japan, by the way, and we have these trilateral discussions, frankly, about that. But our own political frictions are getting in the way of doing anything about that underlying consensus. We're so fixated on whether we're going to, the president put tariffs on the EU, and whether the EU is going to fight back now with a new commission against the United States, that we're not harnessing our consensus to do anything about China. So it's ineffective. And unfortunately, I don't see, under this president, I don't see that changing. I think that would be a difference with the Democratic administration. You would get tough on China, but realizing we have to come together with our allies who basically share the same approach and do it together, and do it through the institutions. Why not bring China to the WTO and say, there are all these things you're not adhering to? Because it seems to me the EU approach to China would be sort of a WTO 2.0 strategy, which is a kind of a new accession, if you will, under the terms that China should adhere to. So I think we're having problems with that, and I don't see it being resolved anytime soon.
Yes, maybe I will start with a notion of transactional policy. We often speak about Trump as being transactional president. Well, I believe that the United States is a transactional country, regardless, administration. If you speak to some ambassadors or former ambassadors of serving in Washington, they would tell you that it has always been like that. Any phone calls, any access to the U.S. president was, transactional. What can you give me for that? That was, a kind of the immediate response. The difference is, I think, now with Donald Trump, that, for at least half a century, there was a notion of common cause of democratic nations. So, however, there was a transactional, mode there, but both sides, understood that we are really allies, and we are doing something together because it is in our interest to do something together. Now I believe that Donald Trump first doesn't comprehend, what kind of role strategy plays in shaping this common cause. Then he believes that even his agreement with a common cause is transactional. So he may be actually on the same page with the others, but he needs to have a clear gains out of that. And that's a different thing. He's not the first, of course, the president who may have a problem with comprehending, the real meaning of strategy. There was a long list of predecessors who also didn't understand why we need experts, why we need strategies, why we need to talk to each other in a strategic way, and why we need to work on common cause. That's because it's not for granted. It's not something which is again goes without saying. We need to work on common cause, and this book is also about this. How both United States, different administrations, because I agree that the Clinton approach, the White House with very different, or entered the White House with very different set of ideas in mind. He didn't want to invest politically in Europe. The same, by the way, with George W. Bush. Few people remember that he was running his campaign on the slogan that about the pivot to China. That China would be the first and the most significant challenge to the United States policies. And then, of course, September 11th came, and all things turned up and down. About China thing, we made a mistake. We, as a collective West, made a mistake in the 90s. Perhaps driven by this notion of Europe whole and free, and that everything would be okay, we accept China description of themselves based on the logic of one country, two systems. Which one system was based on freedom, but another one was based on unfreedom. And actually, we believe that a merge of these two systems is possible. And we trade this for the access to Chinese market. That the problem now we have with China is that it is an autocratic country, undemocratic. And it requires a level playing field with democratic players. That's the problem, particularly if we deal with high-tech technologies. Because that's the difference, huge difference. Who provides actually artificial intelligence? Democratic country or undemocratic country? Thank you very much.
And I think we will leave our audience with this question. Thank you very much for making all this way from Warsaw, Stockholm, the US. Good luck also to PISM with opening, obviously, the office in Brussels. And I hope we will have more of those discussions in the months and years to come. I personally encourage you to read this book. It is a very fair assessment, I think, of what happened in the last 30 years. Authors do not escape difficult questions, including the current rifts between the East and West, which I think is something that we ought to be doing. And I think you deserved a very big applause. Thank you very much also to you for attending.